Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling a dynamic that has honestly baffled, frustrated, and fascinated people for generations. How exactly do the rich stay rich while the poor stay poor? We're going to go way beyond the usual oversimplified narratives of single villains or heroes here. Instead, we're going to unpack the actual structural systems, the economic math, and the psychological realities that really shape financial mobility. Okay, let's dive right into this really fascinating question. I think a lot of us just assume poverty is, well, a lack of money, right? But what if it's actually an entire architecture of penalties? What if the systems we think are designed for efficiency implicitly assume you already have stability, liquidity, and all these financial buffers? To understand how the two ends of the economic spectrum diverge so sharply, we need to look at a concept sociologists and economists use to describe this exact disparity.
So this was coined by sociologist Robert Merton, and it's called the Matthew effect. It brilliantly illustrates how wealth basically acts like a giant gravitational pull toward more wealth, while poverty pulls you toward compounding costs. Small initial differences, like say starting with a tiny asset versus a tiny debt, they get amplified by orders of magnitude over time. If you start with assets, you are on a fundamentally different compounding trajectory than if you start with debt.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The Matthew effect, 2. How capital compounds itself, 3. The expensive reality of poverty, 4. The psychology of scarcity, 5. Structural barriers and systems, and finally, 6. Actionable takeaways and nuance. All right, section 1, the Matthew effect. Let's look at how this gap actually builds up over time. The data clearly shows this stark, widening divergence between the top and bottom social classes across the decades. This tracks a separation drawn from decades of sociological data. And what's really wild is that even when researchers accounted for individual intelligence and work ethic, that structural polarization remained. It essentially proves that the Matthew effect is a measurable reality, where structural advantages and disadvantages compound completely independently of individual effort. Moving to section 2. How capital compounds itself. So how exactly does this top trajectory just accelerate wealth? How do those initial advantages snowball? Economists actually have a pretty fancy word for this, chromatistics. It basically means the practice of money begetting more money. Instead of relying purely on labor to generate income, existing wealth is directed into high-yield investments, real estate, and financial assets. This means the wealthy are insulated from everyday inflation while their assets just multiply. It's a system where wealth grows simply from leveraging the money that's already there. And crucially, this advantage is very often passed down across generations. Families aren't just transferring funds, they're passing down vital financial literacy, risk tolerance, and professional networks. But the math goes way beyond standard investments. $100 billion. Let that sink in. This staggering number represents the estimated annual tax revenue that's literally lost by developing countries due to corporate tax dodging and offshore tax havens. When wealth is stashed offshore by multinational corporations and super-rich individuals, it obviously avoids the taxation that funds public infrastructure, schools, and healthcare. So this keeps vast resources locked right at the top and forces governments to either cut vital services or raise taxes on ordinary citizens. And beyond taxes, we really have to look at market concentration. I mean, we've all heard of monopolies, right? But what about monopsony power? This happens when just a few superstar firms completely dominate the labor market. Because they're the primary employers in an area, worker bargaining power is severely weakened. These firms can essentially keep wages low while magnifying their own profits. It's just another layer of the compounding effect. Dominant firms get bigger, market concentration increases, and the overall labor income share drops. All right, section 3, the expensive reality of poverty. If the top is all about compounding wealth, the bottom is totally defined by compounding expenses. Think about these two drastically contrasting trajectories. With financialization, your money works for you. But then there's the durability tax. Because low-income households often just can't afford the upfront cost of high-quality, long-lasting goods, they're basically forced to buy cheaper items that wear out super quickly. Over time, buying 3 pairs of cheap work boots costs significantly more than just buying one high-quality pair in the first place. The wealthy profit simply from having money, while those without it are quite literally penalized financially for lacking it. The data shows poverty isn't just a lack of income, it's this daily accumulation of invisible taxes. There's a time tax, where relying on inefficient public transit or navigating endless bureaucracy literally steals hours out of your day. There's a spatial gap where disadvantaged neighborhoods just completely lack basic services. And ironically, those with the absolutely least money pay the most for the privilege of accessing it. We're talking about the lowest earners spending up to 10% of their income just on banking fees, overdrafts, and penalties. Just let that number sink in for a second. 200 to 400%. These are the absolutely crushing effective annual interest rates frequently imposed on low-income households through payday loans, check cashing fees, and short-term credit traps. When you're shut out of traditional banking and an emergency hits, you're forced into these secondary financial markets that treat your desperation as a profit center. Section 4. The psychology of scarcity. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth do people accept those predatory loans? Why not just save up? Well, the research reveals a pretty hard truth here. Poverty isn't some kind of character flaw. It's an incredibly heavy cognitive burden. Behavioral economist Senzo Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir discovered that financial desperation physically depletes the brain's executive function. When your mind is constantly calculating how you're going to keep the lights on and feed your family, you literally lose the mental bandwidth required to focus on long-term planning. To actually prove this, researchers conducted the now famous car repair study. They gave shoppers a hypothetical scenario, a car repair costing either $150 or $1,500, and then had them take cognitive tests. For the wealthy participants, the cost didn't matter at all. Their scores stayed exactly the same. But for low-income participants, just thinking about a $1,500 repair caused their cognitive performance to plummet by the equivalent of 13 IQ points. Guys, that is the cognitive equivalent of losing an entire night's sleep. It proves that behaviors often mislabeled as irresponsible are actually cognitive adaptations to severe bandwidth constraints. So when you are literally just fighting to survive today, planning for your retirement or, preventative health for tomorrow, it becomes neurologically incredibly difficult. This is a phenomenon called tunneling. Your brain forces you to focus entirely on the immediate threat while heavily discounting the future. Taking out a 400% interest payday loan looks like a terrible idea as someone with a healthy savings account, but to a brain stuck in scarcity mode, it is a completely rational survival mechanism to stop an immediate disaster. Section 5. Structural barriers and systems. Now let's look at how systemic obstacles actually interact with this depleted cognitive bandwidth. Think about how incredibly frustrating it is to navigate bureaucracy on a good day. Now try to imagine doing it while you're completely cognitively depleted. This is known as administrative burden. For instance, complex systems result in roughly 20% of eligible households failing to claim the earned income tax credit simply because the bureaucratic hurdle is just way too high. Now, it's worth noting that this brings up a massive debate, right? How much of financial mobility is dictated by these rigid structures versus the power of individual choices? While stories of incredible upward and downward mobility absolutely do exist, systems that are heavy in administrative burden ensure the climb is incredibly steep for those starting at the very bottom. Section 6, actionable takeaways and nuance. We've covered some massive systemic forces and psychological realities here. So what are the practical, evidence-based steps we can actually take away from this explainer? Now, while structural problems obviously require structural solutions, your individual financial behaviors still matter immensely. Step 1, automate your savings and investments, even if it's literally just a few dollars a month. Automation completely removes that daily decision-making burden. Step 2, actively avoid high-interest debt traps. And step 3, recognize your own temporal discounting. Acknowledge that while the system may be stacked, building an emergency buffer and practicing long-term financial literacy are truly your best shields against that scarcity mindset. I really want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If we know for a fact that complex bureaucracies and a lack of financial buffers literally drain our cognitive capacity, how do we design a more equitable world for everyone? True upward mobility might not just be about raising incomes. It might actually be about removing the invisible taxes and cognitive burdens that trap people in the first place. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.